In the heart of Africa, in a time when the world turned a blind eye to the horrors that occurred on distant shores, there was a tragedy so hidden in the folds of colonial history that it still remains a shadow in the dark corners of global memory. The Belgian colonization of the Congo was more than just an empire-building enterprise, it was a systematic campaign of exploitation, brutality, and dehumanization, its echoes still reverberating in the modern world. But buried within the depths of this horrifying history lies a story that remains largely untold, a story of stolen innocence and lost identities. It begins with a simple but chilling fact: the Belgian colonizers did not just claim the land, the people, and the resources, they claimed the bodies of African women. They took them as objects, as nothing more than tools in the colonial machine that would fuel their empire. Women, often the backbone of their communities, became victims in a brutal system designed to degrade and exploit. The forced labor camps, the brutal treatment, the systematic dehumanization, these were the familiar horrors of the Belgian Congo. But there was something darker, something more insidious that followed. What the world did not know, and what many still refuse to acknowledge, was the birth of thousands of children who were the products of violence, conceived through rape, force, and terror. Children who would grow up in a world far from their birthright, their mothers, and their African heritage. The colonizers didn't just erase the history of these women, they erased the histories of their children too. These children, born from the brutality of colonial violence, were taken from their mothers and stripped of their heritage, raised far from their homeland in a foreign, alien world. Many were raised in Europe, in orphanages, in institutions that viewed them as nothing more than symbols of a foreign conquest, not as human beings with lives and cultures of their own. Some were raised as mere tools of colonial propaganda, symbols of Belgium's civilizing mission. As these children grew older, many of them began to question their origins, their identities. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why were they raised in a foreign land, far from the families who had given birth to them, only to be told that their origins were a secret, a shame too dark to acknowledge? These questions were never answered, and most of these children, those who survived, lived their lives in a fog of lost heritage and painful ignorance. Their story, too, was erased. And today, there is little recognition of their existence, let alone a reckoning for the atrocities that brought them into the world. But even as the Belgian government did its best to silence the truth, to bury these stories in the past, there are still whispers today. In Congo, in Belgium, and among the descendants of those involved, there are still stories that have been passed down from generation to generation. Stories of mothers who lost their children. Stories of children who were taken, never to see their mothers again. And yet, despite the years that have passed, the tragedy of the stolen children of the Belgian Congo remains a question with no answer. The world has, over time, forgotten the true cost of colonialism. Some of the most horrific chapters of history have been erased or minimized, their victims consigned to silence. This is one of those stories. It is a story that, until recently, few were willing to tell, and even fewer were brave enough to hear. But what happened to those children, and why has their story been kept so quiet? Why, after all these years, do we know so little about what truly transpired in the Congo under Belgian rule? What is known is that the Belgian Congo was one of the most brutal regimes in the history of colonization. King Leopold II, who ruled the Congo Free State as his personal fiefdom, was not just an empire builder, he was a tyrant who committed atrocities on an unimaginable scale. The Congolese were enslaved, exploited, and subjected to a reign of terror that left scars on the country that would last for generations. Leopold's reign, which lasted from 1885 to 1908, is marked by widespread abuse, including forced labor, mass killings, and brutal punishment. It's estimated that as many as 10 million Congolese people perished during this period. But while the world focused on the mass killings, the forced labor, and the horrific mutilations, there was another, darker element to the story that was hidden beneath the surface. The story of the stolen children begins with the systematic rape and sexual exploitation of African women. These women were often brought to the attention of Belgian soldiers or officials in various ways, some by force, others through coercion. They were made to serve the colonialists in ways unimaginable to most. And in a time when African women's lives were devalued, when their pain went unnoticed, these women were not seen as victims, they were seen as nothing more than tools to be used for the furthering of the colonial project. But when these women became pregnant, a new, horrifying chapter of the story began. These children, born of violence, were not allowed to live the lives they should have. They were taken from their mothers, sometimes immediately after birth, and placed in orphanages far from their homes. This was not an isolated event. It was not a series of tragic accidents or the actions of a few cruel individuals. No, this was part of a larger system, one that was designed to erase the African identity of these children and replace it with something foreign, something colonial. The children were taken, stolen from their mothers, and raised in a world that refused to acknowledge their origins. And their mothers? They were left behind, often in silence, sometimes in shame, their trauma ignored by a world that had already moved on from the brutality of their lives. The system that allowed this to happen was not a temporary aberration. It was deliberate. It was systematic. And it was horrific. And yet, for decades, the world at large knew nothing about it. It wasn't until much later, in the wake of growing awareness of the true cost of colonialism, that the story of the stolen children began to surface. But even now, it remains buried, hidden in the archives, forgotten in the whispers of history. How could something so monumental, so deeply tragic, be erased from history? In the end, the question remains, why have these children, and their mothers, been forgotten? Why has the world turned a blind eye to this part of history? This is not just a story of colonization, it is a story of stolen identities, of erasure, and of a legacy that continues to haunt the descendants of those who were wronged. It is a story that demands to be told. And so, we begin with a simple truth: the legacy of the Belgian colonization of the Congo is not just one of exploitation and death. It is one of stolen lives, of children who were never allowed to know who they truly were. This is their story, and it begins with a tragedy that continues to echo across the centuries. At the dawn of the 19th century, much of Africa was little more than a blank space on European maps, vast, untamed wildernesses marked only by borders drawn by the imperial powers. Among these powers, Belgium stood as a relatively small, newly formed state, but its ambitions were far greater than its size. While the rest of Europe sought riches through trade and territorial expansion, Belgium set its sights on a piece of land thousands of miles away, the Congo. The narrative of Belgium's colonization of Congo is not one of gradual expansion or peaceful settlement, but rather one of brutal conquest, unchecked exploitation, and horrific violence that would scar the African continent for generations to come. The Congo Free State, which would later become a Belgian colony, was not established through diplomacy or mutual consent, but through a personal ambition, a brutal grab for resources and power by King Leopold II of Belgium. It is essential to understand that the Congo was never intended to be a national possession. Instead, it was the personal property of King Leopold, who viewed the Congo as his private empire, separate from the Belgian state. His desire to control the Congo was driven by his thirst for wealth and the opportunity to exploit its natural resources, rubber, ivory, and minerals, without the oversight or constraints of European governments or international law. And to ensure his personal wealth, Leopold used the people of Congo as tools of labor, extracting their work under the threat of extreme violence and intimidation. The Congo Free State was officially founded in 1885 under Leopold's sole control. However, this free state was far from free for the people who lived within its borders. For nearly 2 decades, the Congolese were subjected to a reign of terror that is difficult to comprehend. Leopold's personal army, the Force Publique, was charged with ensuring the exploitation of the land and its people. Their methods were brutal. Villages were razed, women and children were held hostage, and men were forced into labor, all under the threat of punishment by death or mutilation. Those who resisted were often subjected to horrific acts of violence, hands and feet hacked off as punishment for failing to meet quotas. The brutality of the regime became infamous worldwide, yet it continued unchecked for years. The violence and terror that Leopold's regime inflicted upon the Congolese people were not isolated events. They were part of a larger, more insidious system, a system built on the exploitation of African bodies and lives, a system that viewed African people not as humans, but as commodities. In a period when many European powers still considered Africans to be lesser beings, the horrors that took place in Congo were not seen as aberrations but as inevitable consequences of imperial rule. The belief in European superiority was so deeply ingrained that the colonizers thought nothing of brutalizing the Congolese population, taking what they wanted, and leaving devastation in their wake. In this world of oppression and exploitation, the lives of African women were devalued beyond measure. They were not seen as individuals with autonomy but as bodies to be controlled. Women were forced to work in rubber plantations, to carry out arduous labor in the face of constant threat. Yet, even this unimaginable cruelty was not enough for the Belgian colonizers. Women, already subjected to the harshest forms of labor, became the targets of even greater violence. Rape was not an isolated act, it was a tool of control, a means of further degrading African people, and a method used to increase the population of mixed-race children who could later be removed and raised elsewhere. The true scope of this violence is difficult to comprehend. The women who were raped by Belgian soldiers were not only victims of sexual violence but were also forced to bear the children of their colonizers, children who were the product of violence and exploitation. The children born from these violent encounters were not welcomed as human beings. Rather, they were treated as symbols of the brutality of the colonization process, the products of a system that sought to erase African culture and identity. And yet, this was not the full extent of the story. Once these children were born, they were taken away from their mothers, often immediately after birth, under the premise of civilizing them. Belgian authorities and missionaries believed that by raising these children in Europe or in Belgian-run orphanages, they could be molded into something better, something more European, more like the colonizers. The children were separated from their African roots, raised in environments that not only denied them their cultural heritage but also stripped them of their personal identities. The system that Leopold set up was efficient in its cruelty. Many of the children were raised in Belgium, where they were raised in orphanages, far from the land of their birth. They were taught to speak French or Dutch, forced to abandon their African languages, and educated in a system designed to suppress their native identity. They were taught that they were products of a higher civilization, but in reality, they were cast aside as forgotten relics of a colonial nightmare. Their mothers, on the other hand, were left behind in Congo, often struggling to survive in a world that had been irrevocably altered by colonial violence. Many of these women never saw their children again, and their pain was largely ignored by the Belgian government, which worked tirelessly to suppress any acknowledgement of the atrocities that were taking place. The brutality of this system is almost unfathomable, but the real horror lies in the fact that it was not an aberration. It was an intentional, systematic program designed to erase African culture and identity, to turn African women into tools of exploitation and to strip away the very essence of a people. The children who were stolen from their mothers and raised in orphanages were not anomalies, they were products of a system that sought to further enslave the African population, even long after physical slavery was officially abolished. But these stolen children were not the only victims. The indigenous population of Congo, which had been subjected to years of forced labor and physical punishment, had no way of resisting the Belgian government's plans. Resistance movements were brutally crushed, and the vast majority of the population had no choice but to comply with the demands of their colonial masters. The colonizers took whatever they needed, whether it was land, resources, or human lives. The Congolese people were trapped in a world of exploitation, their identities and culture discarded in favor of a colonial regime that viewed them as nothing more than instruments of labor. As Leopold's grip on Congo tightened, his empire grew wealthier. The rubber and ivory extracted from Congo funded much of Belgium's industrial growth, and his personal fortune grew exponentially. Yet, in the midst of this wealth, there was an untold cost, a cost borne by the Congolese people, by the African women who had been exploited, and by the children who had been stolen from their mothers. This is the world into which these children were born, a world of exploitation, cruelty, and dehumanization. Their stories, erased for so long, remain largely untold. But they are no less important. They are a part of the legacy of Belgium's colonial empire, a legacy that has left scars on the Congo, on Belgium, and on the world at large. The history of these stolen children is not a footnote in the story of colonization. It is a vital part of the history that must be remembered, for it speaks not only to the cruelty of one nation, but to the enduring trauma of a colonial system that has yet to fully reckon with its past. The full scale of the Belgian colonizers' exploitation of African women remains largely unspoken, buried beneath layers of history and denial. Yet, the reality of their bodies being claimed by foreign rulers cannot be hidden forever. It was not just the land or the resources that Belgium sought to possess in Congo, the women, too, became part of a tragic calculus of conquest. In a colonial system where power, race, and gender intersected violently, women of the Congo were forced into an existence that reduced them to mere tools in the expansion of Belgium's empire. The brutal treatment they endured was not incidental, it was part of a larger, systematic effort to exploit every aspect of the Congolese population. The rapes were not a sporadic consequence of Belgian brutality, they were an integral part of the colonial machine, encouraged by the very structure of power that had been imposed upon the Congolese people. Belgian soldiers, officers, and settlers saw no moral or legal barriers to their desires. The lives of African women were regarded with the same disregard as the land itself, simply another commodity to be used and discarded. The violence against them was sanctioned, even normalized, as part of the civilizing mission that colonial powers felt justified in carrying out. For the women, the suffering was multifaceted. They were caught between the immediate violence of rape and the long-term consequences of this violence, which would ripple through their communities. There was a sense of helplessness that pervaded their lives. Many were separated from their families or communities, forced into isolation by the very powers that controlled them. The emotional and psychological toll of this violence cannot be overstated. These women were not simply physically harmed, their lives were upended in every sense, shattering the foundations of their identities and cultures. Yet, perhaps the most tragic aspect of the whole situation was the erasure of these women's agency. The Belgian colonizers saw them not as individuals with their own identities, but as pawns in a much larger game. They were reduced to their bodies, seen as vessels for colonizers' desires, tools in a system that existed solely for the extraction of resources and labor. As a result, their stories have been silenced for generations, their voices drowned out by the noise of colonial expansion and the passing of time. Few recognize the depth of their suffering, and even fewer acknowledge the babies that were born from this violence. The children who were born into this world were not just victims of their mother's abuse, they were the living symbols of a dark colonial legacy. The babies, often born in secrecy or under the cover of shame, were torn away from their mothers almost as soon as they drew breath. These children were not allowed to grow up in their ancestral homeland. Instead, they were removed from the Congo and sent to orphanages in Belgium, sometimes still in infancy, as part of a program designed to civilize them. There was no recognition of the deep, irreparable loss that these children faced. They were taken from their mothers, sometimes never to see them again, and raised in environments that rejected their African heritage. These children were not given the chance to grow up as the people they were born to be. They were not given the chance to develop a sense of belonging to the land of their birth, to speak the languages of their ancestors, or to experience the culture that had shaped their families for centuries. Instead, they were placed in institutions that stripped them of their identities, forcing them to conform to the Belgian way of life. In the eyes of the Belgian authorities, these children were seen as little more than products to be molded and manipulated, shaped to fit into the colonial vision of what a civilized African should look like. The fate of these children is as tragic as it is complex. They were raised far from their mothers, far from their culture, and far from their home. They were told that they were the lucky few who had been chosen to experience a better life, a life of opportunity in Europe. But this narrative was a lie. These children were not lucky. They were victims of a brutal colonial system that had no interest in their well-being, only in using them as instruments to further the empire's goals. Many of these children grew up with a profound sense of dislocation. They were taught to reject their African heritage, to see it as inferior, as something to be ashamed of. They were raised in a world that saw them as half European, but never truly accepted them as such. They were neither fully African nor fully Belgian. They were, in essence, lost children, children without a home, without a true identity. Their lives were shaped by a system that had no respect for their humanity, that saw them as little more than pawns in a political game. As these children grew older, many began to ask questions about their origins, about the circumstances of their birth. They felt an innate sense that something was wrong, that their lives had been shaped by forces beyond their control. Yet, answers were rarely forthcoming. The Belgian authorities had made sure that their histories were erased, and the mothers who had borne them were too often silenced or forgotten. These children, caught in the space between two worlds, struggled with a deep sense of loss and confusion. They felt disconnected from their mothers, who were often too far away to provide any comfort or sense of identity. The emotional trauma these children experienced cannot be underestimated. They were deprived not just of their mothers, but of their culture, their language, and their heritage. They were raised in an environment that rejected everything about their African identity and replaced it with a foreign, imposed one. This caused profound psychological damage that lasted throughout their lives, as many of these children found it impossible to reconcile the two halves of their identity, the African and the European. For the mothers of these children, the trauma was just as deep. Forced into a system that saw them as nothing more than breeding vessels for the colonizers' needs, they were left to watch as their children were torn from their arms. For many women, the pain of losing their children was compounded by the isolation and helplessness they felt. Their voices were silenced, their pain ignored, and their suffering erased from history. These women were not just victims of sexual violence, they were victims of a system that had no respect for their lives, their identities, or their very existence. In many ways, the stolen children were symbolic of the larger colonial project. They were the living proof of the violence and dehumanization that colonialism inflicted upon the African people. They were the products of a system that sought to exploit, to erase, and to transform an entire people's identity. And yet, these children were not merely victims, they were survivors. They lived in the shadow of a history that sought to strip them of everything that made them who they were, and yet, their stories remained largely untold. The tragedy of these stolen children is not just one of historical neglect, but one that continues to haunt the descendants of both the colonizers and the colonized. The scars of this history run deep, and the trauma of those who suffered through it has yet to be fully acknowledged. But as the stories of these women and children begin to surface, it becomes clear that their history deserves to be heard. The full truth of the Belgian colonization of the Congo, the rape, the exploitation, the stealing of children, must be told, for it is a story that is far from over. In the midst of the terror that swept through the Congo under Belgian rule, the true scale of the tragedy involving the children born from colonizer exploitation was hidden from the world. These children, the byproducts of rape and violence, were more than just victims of their circumstances. They represented the darkest, most haunting part of Belgium's colonial legacy, a legacy that was methodically erased and silenced for generations. For these children, the world they were born into was not one of love, warmth, or cultural heritage, but one defined by brutality, silence, and a sense of profound dislocation. Their existence, from the moment they took their first breaths, was dictated by a larger system that viewed them as tools, not as human beings with rights, identities, or futures. When these children were born, their very existence became a thorn in the side of the Belgian colonial project. They were not supposed to exist in the way they did. They were supposed to be erased, either through forced assimilation or, more often than not, by being removed entirely from the lives of their mothers. The colonial powers wanted to control their narrative, shaping them into symbols of European superiority, a proof of Belgium's civilizing mission. But these children were also witnesses to something darker, a legacy of violence that could not be so easily wiped away. The Belgian authorities understood this. They knew that the children, if left to grow up in their mother's care, would serve as reminders of the atrocities committed by the colonizers. They would be visible proof of the sexual violence, the abuse, and the dehumanization that had been inflicted on the African population. Thus, in a calculated move, the Belgian colonizers decided to separate the children from their mothers as early as possible. In doing so, they effectively erased the familial bonds, severed the connections between mother and child, and created a new generation of children who would be disconnected from their roots. The mothers, whose suffering was already so immense, were left to endure the additional trauma of having their children taken from them. This was not a simple act of separation, it was an act of cultural violence. By removing the children from their mothers, the Belgian colonizers ensured that these children would not grow up with a sense of belonging to their people or their heritage. They would grow up in orphanages, far from the Congo, with little to no knowledge of the culture, language, or history they were born into. Instead, they were taught to reject their African roots and adopt the language, culture, and identity of their colonizers. In these orphanages, the stolen children were subjected to an education that was as much about assimilation as it was about protection. The Belgian authorities wanted to erase the traces of their African origins. They were taught to speak French or Dutch, and their African names were often discarded or replaced with European ones. These children were taught to view their own heritage as inferior, to see their mothers and their people as something to be ashamed of. They were told they were lucky, that they had been chosen to experience the benefits of European civilization, but in truth, they were stripped of their own identities. They were caught in a world where they didn't belong to either culture fully, never fully accepted as Belgian, but unable to reconnect with the African heritage they had been severed from. Many of these children grew up in Europe, particularly in Belgium, where they were raised as symbols of colonial success. To the Belgian public, they were proof that their colonial project had brought civilization to the savage lands of Africa. They were paraded as success stories, examples of how the Belgian Empire was changing Africa for the better. However, behind the facade of success, the children were living a different reality. They were constantly reminded that they were different from the Belgian children around them, and different from their African mothers who had been reduced to mere memories. Growing up in this environment was not easy for these children. They faced the internal conflict of having no clear identity. They were seen as other in both cultures, never fully belonging to the European world that raised them, yet always reminded of their African origins, which they were taught to reject. They were often treated with suspicion and disdain by the very society that claimed to have given them a better life. The emotional cost of this dislocation was immense, leading to a sense of loneliness, confusion, and often anger. These children were not given the opportunity to form their own identities. Instead, they were forced to live within a framework created by colonizers who saw them as nothing more than the products of their imperial violence. For many, the search for their origins was an impossible journey. With no real connection to their mothers, to the land where they were born, or to the cultural traditions that had shaped their early lives, they found themselves adrift in a world that saw them as both too African and not European enough. They were trapped between two identities, one they were born into, but could not claim, and one they were forced to adopt, but could never fully embrace. The trauma of this identity struggle left many with deep scars, mental anguish, and a sense of profound loss that could never be healed. Even as these children grew older and began to search for answers, they found little help in uncovering their pasts. The Belgian authorities had worked tirelessly to erase the memories of the atrocities they had committed. The names of these children were often not recorded, their stories buried under layers of secrecy. Even the mothers who had borne them were erased from the historical record. This deliberate obscuration of the truth meant that the stolen children had to face an even greater challenge, not just the pain of their personal loss, but the collective denial of their history. And yet, despite the efforts to suppress the truth, whispers of the stolen children began to surface in the late 20th century. Activists, historians, and descendants of the Congolese people began to demand that the atrocities of Belgian colonial rule be acknowledged. It was through their efforts that the existence of the stolen children began to be brought into the light. However, the full extent of the program, the number of children who had been taken, and the long-term effects on both the children and their families remain questions with no definitive answers. The Belgian government, which had long denied responsibility for the horrors committed in the Congo, was slow to acknowledge the truth. Despite this, the efforts to uncover the fate of these stolen children have continued, albeit in fits and starts. Survivors have spoken out, and scholars have dug into the archives to uncover what happened. Some of the stolen children, now adults, have begun the painful process of reconnecting with their African roots, attempting to reclaim a heritage that was stolen from them before they could even understand what it was. Their stories have sparked a reckoning in Belgium, forcing the country to come to terms with its colonial past. But for many of these children, the journey toward understanding and healing will never be fully complete. The trauma they endured, the loss of their mothers, the rejection of their heritage, the erasure of their identities, cannot be undone by apologies or even by recognition of the wrongs that were committed. The legacy of the stolen children is one of profound grief and injustice, a reminder of the darkness that lies at the heart of colonialism. It is a legacy that still lingers today, as the descendants of those affected by these crimes continue to grapple with the consequences of a history that has been hidden for far too long. And while the stolen children may no longer be children, their stories remain just as crucial, stories of resilience, pain, and the undying need for recognition and remembrance. The silence that surrounded the stolen children of the Belgian Congo was not absolute. Beneath the surface of colonial denial and state-sanctioned erasure, there were whispers, rumors passed in hushed tones, often behind closed doors, among the few who dared to question the official narrative. In Belgium, the truth about the Congolese children stolen from their mothers was kept hidden, but in Congo itself, in the villages and among the survivors, there was a growing awareness of the tragedy unfolding. As time passed, these whispers began to carry further, reaching beyond the borders of the Congo to the Belgian public, where the reality of what had happened started to seep through the cracks of imperial propaganda. The first hints that something was amiss came from the very people who were most directly affected, the Congolese mothers, whose children had been torn away from them, and the community members who witnessed the violence and the aftermath. For years, the Belgian government and colonial authorities sought to keep these stories buried, making it illegal to speak about the atrocities in public or to question the supposed benevolence of Belgian rule in the Congo. But even in such an environment of oppression and fear, the truth began to emerge. The whispers began slowly. In remote villages, among families who had been victims of the colonial violence, stories of missing children began to surface. It was a slow trickle at first, no one dared speak openly about what had happened, for fear of retribution, but the rumors persisted. Some said that children had been taken in the dead of night, their mothers left to wonder where they had gone. Others claimed that the children were raised in distant orphanages, far from the reach of their families, and that they were taught to forget their roots. In the absence of proof, the rumors were often dismissed as superstition, as local folklore, or even as exaggerations. But as the years went on, the rumors took on a different shape. The survivors of the stolen children, those who had managed to escape or had been separated from their families during the chaotic years of Belgian rule, began to speak out. These individuals had lived through the horrors of colonialism and had witnessed firsthand the cruel and calculated removal of children from their mothers. They were no longer willing to remain silent. The stories that had once been confined to whispers in the dark began to be shared in public spaces, slowly gaining traction among the wider population. These first whispers, though fragile, were not without their power. They became the foundation for a larger conversation about the legacy of Belgian colonization. In Congo, where the scars of colonial violence were still fresh, many understood the pain of the stolen children, even if they did not fully comprehend the scope of the tragedy. The survivors, especially those who had been children themselves, began to speak of the lasting trauma of being torn away from their families and their land. For these individuals, the stolen children represented a generation lost, a generation whose history had been erased, and whose suffering had been ignored for too long. In Belgium, however, the whispers were not as easily heard. The Belgian public had been carefully shielded from the true horrors of their nation's colonial empire. The atrocities of the Congo, including the systematic rape of African women and the forced removal of their children, had been buried beneath a facade of humanitarian rhetoric. The Belgian government had long maintained that their mission in Congo was one of benevolence, that they were bringing civilization to a dark and savage land. In this narrative, there was no place for the stolen children, no room for the brutal reality that had taken place under King Leopold II's rule. For decades, the truth was suppressed, and the voices of the victims were ignored. The few who spoke out were silenced, their claims dismissed as fabrications or exaggerated accounts. The dominant historical narrative, one that celebrated Belgium's role as a civilizing force in Africa, remained largely uncontested. But as the whispers in Congo grew louder, the pressure began to build. It became increasingly difficult to ignore the questions that were being asked, to pretend that the stolen children were just a figment of imagination. In the latter half of the 20th century, the political landscape began to shift. Belgium, like much of Europe, was grappling with its colonial past, with the questions surrounding the legacies of its imperial empire gaining more visibility. Activists, historians, and members of the Congolese diaspora started to demand that the Belgian government face the reality of its colonial crimes. The whispers that had once been dismissed as rumors now found their voice in the public sphere. Through advocacy, research, and historical inquiry, the stolen children began to come into view. In Belgium, the story of the stolen children was not immediately embraced. The country's sense of national pride, built on the idea of Belgian superiority, was deeply intertwined with the legacy of its colonial rule. The idea that Belgium's empire had committed such atrocities was a bitter pill to swallow, and many in the government were resistant to the notion that their nation's history needed to be rewritten. However, the pressure to confront the past could not be avoided forever. As the decades passed, more and more evidence began to surface, and the demands for accountability grew louder. Historians began to uncover records and documents that detailed the existence of the stolen children. These documents, some of which had been locked away in private archives or buried in obscure government files, painted a chilling picture of a system that had systematically stolen children from their mothers as part of a larger effort to suppress and erase African culture. The records revealed how children, born from the violent rapes of African women, were removed from their families and sent to orphanages or to Belgium itself, where they were raised under the guise of civilization. Even as these revelations began to surface, the Belgian government remained reluctant to fully acknowledge the scope of the crimes that had been committed in the Congo. It wasn't until the 1990s, when the country began to confront its colonial history more openly, that the first formal efforts were made to uncover the full extent of the atrocities. Survivors of the stolen children, now adults, began to speak out, sharing their stories of dislocation, loss, and the pain of being separated from their mothers. These voices, once silenced, began to shape the public conversation about Belgium's colonial past. Yet, despite the growing awareness and the increasing number of people who spoke out, the question remained, how many stolen children had there truly been? The Belgian government, in its reluctance to face the full truth, continued to downplay the scale of the program, claiming that it had been an isolated incident, an unfortunate side effect of a larger colonial project. But for the survivors, the stolen children were not an isolated incident. They were the living proof of a system that had been designed to erase their identities, their histories, and their cultures. The whispers that began in the villages of the Congo had finally turned into a roar, but there was still much work to be done. The stolen children, and the mothers who had been silenced for so long, continued to struggle for recognition and justice. The first whispers had grown into a full-fledged movement, one that would not be easily dismissed or ignored. Yet, even as the voices of the stolen children gained strength, the scars of their past remained deeply ingrained, impossible to erase, and their struggle for recognition and reconciliation continued. For years, the Belgian government worked tirelessly to suppress the truth about its colonial past. The story of the stolen children, born of rape and systematically removed from their mothers, was not one that fit within the narrative Belgium sought to maintain. Belgium, as a nation, took great pride in the image of itself as a benevolent force in Africa, a nation that had brought civilization and progress to the dark heart of the Congo. This image, carefully crafted over decades, was built on the back of denial and a refusal to confront the brutality of Belgium's colonial empire. The scale of the crimes committed under King Leopold II was staggering, yet it was largely swept under the rug. For much of the 20th century, the atrocities of the Congo Free State were either ignored or minimized in Belgian history. The story that Belgium told itself, and the world, was one of a civilizing mission, of noble efforts to uplift a backward people. To admit the truth would mean confronting a reality that went against the very foundation of Belgium's identity as a colonial power. The stolen children, their mothers silenced, and the generations of trauma left in the wake of colonial violence did not fit into the tidy narrative that the Belgian government and its citizens wanted to embrace. In Belgium, there was a deep reluctance to acknowledge the full extent of the country's imperial history. The nation had long enjoyed the benefits of its colonial empire. The wealth extracted from the Congo was instrumental in funding Belgium's industrial growth and its place on the world stage. Belgium had come to view its colonial dominance as a point of national pride. To admit the scale of the atrocities committed in the Congo would mean not only a reckoning with the brutality of the regime but also a direct challenge to the identity that had been constructed around Belgium's supposed moral superiority. And so, the silence grew. The first real efforts to suppress the story of the stolen children came almost immediately after the Belgian colonial authorities took control of the Congo. With the tragic birth of these children, and the knowledge that their mothers had been victims of violence, came the uncomfortable reality that the Belgian colonizers could not easily erase their own actions. As much as they sought to control the narrative and sanitize the story of their imperial rule, the very existence of these children threatened to expose the lies that had been spun for years. As a result, the Belgian government took measures to hide the truth. In the early 1900s, records of births, including those of the children born from rapes, were systematically destroyed or buried deep in private archives. Efforts to control the public's perception of the Congo Free State were made through propaganda campaigns that painted the Belgian mission in Africa as one of charity and civilization. Any mention of the true costs of colonization, of the stolen children and the horrors they represented, was quickly silenced. The children themselves were raised far from the Congo, often placed in orphanages or institutions, where they were made to forget their African roots and adopt European identities. Their mothers, meanwhile, were left in obscurity, with no recognition or justice for the crimes committed against them. The Belgian government's suppression of the truth extended far beyond the colonial era. For decades, the stories of the stolen children were not told. As the years passed, the children grew into adults, but the silence continued. The trauma of being separated from their mothers, the erasure of their identities, and the loss of their heritage were buried under the weight of colonial amnesia. Many of the stolen children, now adults, struggled with deep psychological scars. They were raised in foreign lands, taught to reject their African heritage, but they were never fully accepted as Belgian. They existed in a liminal space, caught between two worlds, but belonging to neither. The Belgian authorities, knowing that the truth would be a scandal of monumental proportions, continued to bury any attempts to raise awareness of the stolen children's existence. The tragic nature of their birth, the violence their mothers had endured, and the systematic removal of these children from their families was hidden from the Belgian public. It wasn't until much later, long after the colonial era ended, that the voices of the stolen children and their mothers began to be heard, but even then, the Belgian government fought to keep these stories from entering the public consciousness. For decades, the issue of Belgian colonialism remained largely unaddressed. The horrors of the Congo Free State were ignored or downplayed, and the voices of those who had suffered were kept silent. This was true not only for the stolen children but for the many other victims of Belgian colonial rule. The Congolese people, who had endured forced labor, mutilation, and murder at the hands of the Belgian authorities, were also forgotten. Their stories, like those of the stolen children, were erased from history, buried beneath the weight of colonial narratives that painted Belgium as a benevolent empire. The Belgian government's refusal to acknowledge the full extent of its colonial past created a culture of silence and denial. For generations, the atrocities committed in the Congo remained hidden from the public eye. The stolen children, the mothers who had borne them, and the families who had been torn apart by colonial violence were left to suffer in silence. And as the years passed, the trauma that had been inflicted on these individuals grew ever deeper, while Belgium continued to distance itself from the dark history it had created. But as the decades passed and the world began to reckon with the legacies of colonialism, the silence surrounding the stolen children started to crack. In the latter half of the 20th century, as decolonization movements swept across Africa and Europe began to confront its imperial past, the voices of those who had been silenced for so long began to rise. Historians, scholars, and activists began to ask questions that had long been ignored, and the story of the stolen children slowly began to emerge from the shadows. Yet, despite the growing evidence and the increasing calls for recognition and justice, the Belgian government continued to resist. The trauma of the stolen children and their mothers, and the profound injustice they had suffered, remained largely unacknowledged by the state. In many ways, the Belgian government's suppression of the truth was as much a part of the colonial legacy as the violence and exploitation that had occurred in the Congo. It was a denial of the humanity of the Congolese people, a refusal to face the horrors that Belgium had inflicted on them, and a desire to preserve the nation's image as a civilizing force. In the face of this suppression, the voices of the stolen children and their descendants grew louder. Activists, academics, and members of the Congolese diaspora began to push for greater recognition of the wrongs that had been done, and for the Belgian government to take responsibility for its colonial crimes. The struggle for recognition, justice, and accountability for the stolen children became a symbol of the larger struggle to confront the legacies of European colonialism and to hold colonial powers accountable for the lasting harm they had caused. The story of the stolen children, though long buried and suppressed, is one that cannot be silenced forever. Their voices, once muffled by colonial erasure and national denial, are now being heard. And as their stories emerge from the shadows, the truth about Belgium's colonial past must be confronted, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how painful. As the whispers of the stolen children gained momentum and the silent suffering of their mothers could no longer be ignored, the pursuit of truth became an urgent necessity. Belgium, for decades, had buried the realities of its colonial past beneath layers of denial, presenting a facade of benevolent rule while suppressing the atrocities that had taken place in the Congo. But as the 20th century unfolded, cracks in this carefully constructed narrative began to appear. The voices of those who had suffered under the Belgian regime were starting to rise, and with them, a growing demand for justice and recognition. The stolen children, once mere whispers in the dark, began to be acknowledged as symbols of a much larger and more pervasive injustice. In the wake of Belgium's reluctant acknowledgement of its colonial history, the quest to uncover the truth about the stolen children became a crucial part of the larger movement to address the legacy of Belgian colonialism in the Congo. These children, who had been born under the harshest of circumstances and removed from their mothers at birth, were not merely victims of a forgotten history, they were living proof of the violence and systemic racism that had permeated the very foundations of Belgian rule. Their stories had been suppressed for far too long, but as time passed, their pain began to break through the silence. The search for truth started in the most unexpected of places, the archives. In Belgium and Congo alike, historians and researchers began to dig through forgotten documents, overlooked records, and government files that had long been hidden away. These documents were key to uncovering the scope of the Belgian colonial regime's actions in the Congo, and, crucially, the fate of the children born from sexual violence. It was not an easy task. These records were often incomplete, lost, or intentionally destroyed, but even in the face of these challenges, there was a growing sense that the truth could no longer be kept from the world. What these historians uncovered was not only deeply disturbing but also profoundly tragic. Detailed accounts of the systematic removal of children from their mothers and their subsequent placement in orphanages or sent to Belgium to be raised as European children began to surface. The records exposed the extent to which these children had been raised in institutions where their African heritage was stripped away, and they were forced to conform to the ideals of their colonial rulers. The more that researchers unearthed, the clearer it became that the stolen children were not simply casualties of random violence, they were victims of a calculated, systematic effort to suppress African identity and culture. One of the most painful revelations from these historical records was the stark reality of how deeply ingrained the idea of racial superiority was in Belgian colonial policy. The children who had been taken from their mothers were not just removed from their families, they were deliberately erased from their heritage. They were viewed not as human beings, but as products of European control that could be molded and manipulated. Belgian authorities did not see these children as the product of violence and oppression but as a tool in their mission to civilize the African population. The idea that these children could be raised without any connection to their African roots was a chilling reminder of the lengths to which the colonizers would go to maintain power over a people they considered inferior. In the Congo, where the memories of the colonial era were still fresh, there was a growing sense of outrage at the historical erasure of the stolen children's existence. The Congolese people, who had endured unimaginable violence under Belgian rule, saw these children as a symbol of everything that had been taken from them, not just their land, their resources, but their very identities. The stolen children were a painful reminder of the cultural destruction that had been inflicted upon the Congo, and the toll it had taken on its people. For the families of the stolen children, the search for truth was an intensely personal journey. Many mothers, who had been violently separated from their children, were left to endure a lifetime of grief and loss. For them, the search for their lost children became a matter of survival. It was not only about uncovering the truth but about seeking a sense of closure, of knowing what had happened to the children they had borne but were never allowed to raise. Yet, for most mothers, that truth would remain elusive. Even as the stolen children were finally acknowledged, the likelihood of reuniting them with their mothers was slim. Many of the mothers had already passed away, their pain buried in the sands of time. But the children, now adults, still carried the scars of their stolen beginnings, and the desire to reclaim their lost identities and histories drove them to search for answers. The emotional toll of this search was immense. For the stolen children, there was a deep yearning to understand who they were, where they came from, and why they had been torn from their mothers at birth. For many, it was a journey fraught with heartache and frustration. The records that might have held the key to their past were often incomplete or inaccessible. The emotional dislocation they felt was compounded by the knowledge that their very existence had been shaped by colonial violence. They were caught between two worlds, neither fully African nor fully Belgian, and as they sought answers, they often found themselves rejected by both. The efforts to locate and identify these stolen children became a global movement. Advocacy groups, human rights organizations, and descendants of the victims began to push for accountability and recognition. They demanded that Belgium take responsibility for its colonial crimes and that the stolen children be acknowledged as the victims of a system that sought to destroy their heritage and identity. The push for justice also included calls for reparations, for Belgium to provide compensation to the survivors and their families, and for a formal apology from the Belgian government. However, despite the growing momentum, Belgium was slow to act. The official stance remained one of denial, and it was clear that the Belgian government was not eager to fully reckon with the horrors of its colonial past. Yet, the search for truth continued, fueled by the relentless voices of those who had been silenced for so long. The stolen children, and the mothers who had borne them, were no longer invisible. Their stories were being told, and the world was beginning to listen. This process of discovery and recognition was long overdue, but it was also incredibly painful. The deeper the search went, the more tragic the revelations became. The stolen children had suffered not only from the violence that had been inflicted upon their mothers but from the very system that had been built to erase them. As the 21st century progressed, the push for truth became more urgent. The stolen children, now adults, began to connect with one another, sharing their stories and experiences of growing up in a world where they did not belong. Some were able to trace their roots, to reconnect with their African heritage, but for many, the journey was a painful one. The emotional wounds ran deep, and the healing process would take time, perhaps a lifetime. The search for the truth of the stolen children's legacy is far from over. While some strides have been made in acknowledging the horrors of Belgium's colonial past, much remains to be done. The Belgian government has yet to fully confront its role in the theft of these children, and the stories of many survivors remain untold. However, the persistence of those seeking justice, and the courage of those who have dared to speak out, ensures that the legacy of the stolen children will not be erased again. It is a painful, ongoing process, one that is necessary not only for the survivors but for the generations to come, who must learn from the past to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The collapse of silence surrounding the Belgian colonial legacy did not happen overnight. It took decades of struggle, both within Belgium and the Congo, for the truth about the stolen children to come to light. For generations, Belgium's imperial history had been carefully concealed beneath layers of government-approved rhetoric and public denial. Yet, as the 20th century drew to a close, the relentless pursuit of justice, combined with the efforts of historians, activists, and the descendants of those affected by the atrocities, began to break through the thick veil of silence. The stolen children, once mere symbols of forgotten grief, emerged from the shadows, demanding recognition, accountability, and justice. It wasn't only the historical record that had been suppressed but also the emotional and social trauma experienced by the stolen children and their families. These children, often raised in foreign lands, without connection to their roots or mothers, suffered not only from the violence of their birth but from the dislocation and abandonment that followed. To deny them recognition was to deny the pain of generations of African women who had been raped and violated by Belgian colonizers, and the agony of children who had never known their mothers or their culture. But for too long, these stories had been dismissed, ignored, or hidden away, even by those who claimed to support decolonization and justice. The first steps toward bringing these stories to the global stage came from academic inquiry and grassroots activism. Scholars began to uncover archival documents, some of which had been carefully hidden by the Belgian state, which confirmed the brutal reality of the systematic removal of African children. The stories of these children were initially ignored by the international community, as most of the world was unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truths about European colonialism. But as the world became more attuned to the human rights violations of the past, the stolen children of Congo became part of the larger narrative of colonial exploitation that could no longer be overlooked. Belgium's role in the theft of children from Congo was particularly insidious because it represented a calculated form of cultural genocide. These children, who had been born out of sexual violence, were not only removed from their mothers and families, but their very identities were erased. In the orphanages and institutions where they were placed, they were stripped of their African heritage and forced to adopt European names, language, and ways of life. This erasure of identity was the colonial system's ultimate weapon, a method designed not only to break the spirit of the African population but to make the children of those violated women into living symbols of Belgian superiority. By severing the connection to their mothers and their cultures, Belgium hoped to build a generation of individuals who would be loyal to the European colonizers and who would forget the Africa that had shaped them. However, this strategy, although effective in the short term, was ultimately doomed to fail. As the years passed, and as more and more survivors of Belgian colonialism began to speak out, the cracks in the narrative grew wider. Activists and descendants of those who had suffered began to demand that Belgium face its past. They fought for the stolen children to be recognized as the victims of a systematic effort to destroy African identity, and they pushed for accountability from the Belgian government, which had long turned a blind eye to the suffering it had caused. The struggle to bring the stolen children's story into the light was difficult, especially because of the continuing resistance from the Belgian government. Even as the international community began to recognize the devastating impact of European colonialism, Belgium continued to insist that the darker aspects of its colonial past should remain forgotten. The Belgian government's reluctance to confront the full scale of its crimes against the Congolese people was not limited to the stolen children, it extended to the broader colonial abuses, including forced labor, mutilations, and the mass killings that had occurred during King Leopold II's reign. Yet, despite this resistance, the pressure to address Belgium's colonial crimes grew. Belgium's colonial history became a topic of national debate, with increasing numbers of historians, journalists, and politicians advocating for an official reckoning. As the stories of the stolen children spread, a growing number of Belgian citizens and international observers began to call for a formal apology and reparations. The debate over reparations for colonial crimes became part of a larger global conversation about how former colonial powers should deal with their legacies. Belgium's hesitance to confront its past continued to delay justice for the stolen children. The Belgian government made minimal gestures of reconciliation, but it was clear that the national narrative remained largely unchanged. For many in Belgium, the idea that their ancestors could have committed such atrocities was too uncomfortable to accept. The very foundation of Belgian pride was built upon a historical narrative that painted the country's colonial ambitions as noble and civilizing. Acknowledging the trauma caused by the theft of African children, and the systemic violence that had permeated every facet of Belgian rule in Congo, threatened to dismantle this carefully constructed myth. For the stolen children, however, the struggle for justice had become a matter of personal and collective survival. As more and more survivors began to come forward, their stories helped to humanize the history of colonialism and illuminate the true cost of Belgian rule. The stolen children, now adults, sought recognition, not only for themselves but for the mothers who had never been given a voice. They demanded acknowledgement of their pain and the harm done to their communities, and they fought for reparations and restitution for the generations of Africans who had been exploited under the colonial regime. The emotional impact of this struggle for justice cannot be overstated. Many of the stolen children, now grown, had spent their entire lives searching for their lost identities. They had been deprived of the chance to know their mothers, to learn their native languages, and to inherit their cultural traditions. For them, the journey toward justice was not just about compensation or legal recognition, it was about reclaiming the sense of self that had been stolen from them. Their search for their African roots, their quest to reconnect with the heritage that had been stripped away from them, became a powerful symbol of resilience and survival. As these struggles unfolded, the international community began to take notice. The stolen children's plight became part of a larger conversation about the injustices of colonialism, and the need for global recognition of the crimes committed by European powers in Africa. While Belgium's response remained largely tepid, the global momentum for reparations and historical accountability continued to grow. Despite Belgium's unwillingness to fully address the scope of its colonial crimes, the efforts of activists, historians, and the descendants of the victims helped to shine a light on the darkest corners of European colonialism. The stolen children, whose stories had been erased for so long, began to receive the recognition they had always deserved. Their plight was no longer hidden in the shadows, it had become a symbol of the broader struggles of colonized peoples worldwide. The fight for justice for the stolen children, though far from over, had become a powerful force for historical reckoning and healing. In the wake of the long-suppressed revelations about the stolen children and the brutal legacy of Belgian colonialism in the Congo, the silence that had shrouded this dark chapter of history began to fragment, but not completely dissipate. The Belgian government, despite mounting pressure both domestically and internationally, remained reluctant to provide the level of recognition and accountability demanded by the victims and their descendants. Though some efforts were made to acknowledge the injustice done, the aftermath for those affected remained one of unresolved grief, deep psychological scars, and, for many, a continuing struggle to reclaim lost identities. The trauma experienced by the stolen children, now adults, lingered in the shadows of Belgian society, haunting not only those directly involved but the entire national consciousness. For the stolen children, now scattered across continents and often living in foreign lands far from their birthplaces, the recognition of their plight came too late. The journey to reclaim their lost identities was one marked by immense personal and collective anguish. These individuals, who had been stripped of their mothers, cultures, and histories, were left to grapple with a fragmented sense of self. Many spent their lives trying to reconstruct the pieces of a past that had been forcibly erased, but the psychological and emotional toll was profound. Even when they could trace their roots back to Congo, reconnecting with their heritage was not as simple as locating family members. The trauma of being raised without any connection to their African identity had created a permanent fissure between them and the culture they were born into. The silence that had once been deliberately imposed on this history by the Belgian state was echoed by the wider societal response. While there were isolated calls for justice, for an official apology, and for reparations, Belgium as a nation remained largely divided on the issue. The Belgian public, many of whom had been conditioned by decades of national pride in the civilizing mission of their colonial empire, struggled to come to terms with the uncomfortable truths of their country's past. The lingering question of how to address the deep wounds caused by colonial violence, how to atone for the systematic theft of children, the destruction of cultures, and the generational trauma, remained unresolved. For many, especially the descendants of the stolen children, the apology that came in small, fragmented gestures from the Belgian government felt insufficient. Though Belgium officially acknowledged the injustices of its colonial rule in the Congo, with some key political leaders offering public apologies, the acts of contrition did little to heal the profound scars that colonialism had left behind. These apologies often seemed hollow, like attempts to pacify the growing calls for justice without taking concrete action. The Belgian state, while acknowledging its past, failed to fully confront the emotional and psychological dimensions of the trauma caused by its actions. Words, it seemed, were not enough. The psychological burden faced by the stolen children and their families could not be underestimated. Many of these children, now adults, had spent their lives not only searching for their origins but also battling the intense sense of loss and displacement that came with the erasure of their cultural identity. Raised in European orphanages and institutions, many had been taught to view their African heritage with shame, as something inferior to the European civilization they were expected to embrace. Even as they grew older and began to rediscover their roots, the process of reconciling the two identities, European and African, was never simple or complete. Many found themselves caught in an identity crisis, never fully accepted by either the Belgian society that had raised them or the Congolese community that had borne them. These adults, many of whom had never known the touch of their mothers or the warmth of their ancestral lands, often faced the haunting reality of being too Belgian for Congo and too African for Belgium. Their lives were lived in a liminal space, neither here nor there, constantly searching for a place to belong. The emotional and psychological toll was immense. Some of the stolen children, now adults, sought to reconnect with their families and the communities from which they had been taken, but for most, that journey was impossible. Many of their mothers had passed away, their names lost to history, and the families they might have been born into had either disintegrated or been scattered by the aftermath of Belgian colonization. The silence surrounding their stolen childhoods often extended beyond the personal and into the societal. Belgium, as a whole, struggled to confront the full extent of the violence perpetrated under King Leopold II's rule in the Congo Free State. While a handful of historians, activists, and human rights advocates fought for recognition and reparations, the larger public remained largely indifferent or ill-informed about the extent of the atrocities. The education system, too, had done little to address the reality of Belgium's colonial past. For many Belgians, the colonial era was relegated to the margins of history books, framed as a distant and largely positive chapter that had led to the civilization of Africa. The pain and suffering of the Congolese people, especially the mothers and children torn apart by the colonial regime, were left out of the narrative. For the stolen children and their families, the silence continued to echo in the absence of concrete actions from the Belgian government. The national reluctance to face the truth meant that the victims were left to process their trauma without the full recognition they deserved. Despite some efforts by advocacy groups to push for reparations, Belgium's government remained stubbornly resistant to taking real action. The absence of accountability allowed the painful cycle of historical erasure to continue. In some cases, the Belgian government's refusal to act led to a sense of betrayal among the descendants of the stolen children, who had long awaited justice for their ancestors' suffering. However, the desire for justice did not fade. The struggle for recognition, reparation, and reconciliation continued to grow louder in the 21st century. The stolen children, now adults, sought to reclaim their voices, to demand that their stories be told and their suffering acknowledged. Activists, scholars, and human rights groups fought tirelessly for an official apology from the Belgian government, for reparations to be paid, and for the historical record to reflect the true nature of Belgian colonialism in Congo. The trauma of the stolen children, and the subsequent generations affected by their displacement, remains a bitter reality. Yet, even in the face of continued resistance from the Belgian state, there has been some progress. The global conversation around colonial reparations has grown, with other countries, particularly former colonial powers, beginning to address the injustices of their past. Belgium, though reluctant, is beginning to face mounting pressure to take responsibility for its colonial crimes, to repair the damage it has done to the people of Congo, and to recognize the stolen children as victims of one of the most heinous aspects of imperial violence. Despite the pain, the stolen children's struggle for recognition remains an important part of the wider fight for justice in post-colonial societies. The aftermath of this dark history is far from resolved, but the voices of the victims, those who were stolen from their mothers and from their heritage, continue to resonate in the present. Their ongoing fight for justice, recognition, and healing is not only a testament to their resilience but a demand for the world to confront the truths it has long ignored.